I'm Lori Reynolds, 32, and I worked my way from the reliable kid to a Navy captain trusted with real responsibility. For years, I covered for my family, time, money, rides, planning, quietly keeping things together. But when they told the coordinator, "Keep her out, she's the deadbeat," and parked me outside their celebration, I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been overlooked or humiliated by the very people you've shown up for? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being dismissed, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I was 8 when I learned that families have hierarchies, and I wasn't at the top. My older brother Nathaniel got the bigger bedroom, the newer clothes, the assumption that he'd be somebody important someday. My younger sister Riley got the coddling, the excuses, the belief that her mistakes were just growing pains. I got the responsibilities. Lori, take out the trash. Lori, walk the dog. Lori, watch your sister while we're gone. The requests came daily, couched as favors, but delivered like obligations. I didn't mind at first. I was proud to be trusted, proud to be the one they counted on when things needed doing. But even then, I noticed how Nathaniel never got asked to scrub the kitchen floor, and Riley never had to explain where she'd been after school. My parents ran our house like middle management at a corporation that valued appearances over substance. Dad worked insurance claims, a job that required him to sound authoritative while rarely making real decisions. Mom taught 3rd grade, which meant she spent her days managing other people's children with more patience than she showed her own. They both believed deeply in doing things the right way, which usually meant the way that looked best to neighbors and relatives. When report cards came home, Nathaniel's B- in math got a shrug and a "he's just not a math kid." Riley's C in English earned sympathy about how hard reading was for some children. My A- in chemistry prompted a lecture about how A- weren't quite good enough for someone with my potential. The message was clear: they expected more from me because they believed I was capable of more. But that expectation felt less like faith and more like burden. The pattern solidified during high school. I played varsity soccer while maintaining a 3.8 GPA and working weekends at the local hardware store. Nathaniel played video games and scraped through with a 2.5. Riley got decent grades, but spent most of her time at friends' houses, avoiding chores and family dinners. Yet, somehow I was the one who got lectures about responsibility and commitment. Lori needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her schedule, Dad said one evening when I asked to skip a family dinner for a team banquet. She thinks her activities are more important than family time. I had missed 3 family dinners in 2 years. Nathaniel had missed 3 that month. College brought temporary relief. I earned a partial soccer scholarship to a state school 3 hours away, far enough to feel independent, but close enough for weekend visits. I majored in international relations, drawn to the complexity of how different systems worked together or fell apart. My professors respected my work ethic and analytical mind. My teammates valued my reliability. For 4 years, I existed in a world where competence was rewarded rather than taken for granted. But every time I came home, the old dynamics reasserted themselves. Nathaniel had dropped out of community college and was living in the basement, nominally looking for work but mostly playing online poker. Riley was struggling through her senior year, more interested in her boyfriend than her future. And I was somehow still the problem child for choosing a college major that wasn't practical enough, for playing a sport that wouldn't lead anywhere, for having friends my parents didn't know well enough. The military recruiter visited campus during my junior year. I almost walked past the table, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the way the young officer answered questions with directness instead of deflection. Maybe it was the promise of structure that actually meant something, unlike the arbitrary rules I'd grown up following. Or maybe it was the idea of serving something larger than family politics and small-town expectations. I enlisted as a commissioned officer after graduation, choosing intelligence work because it combined my analytical skills with the opportunity to do something that mattered. My parents' reaction was predictably mixed. They were proud enough to mention my commission to neighbors, but worried enough to keep suggesting I reconsider. It's just that you're so smart, Lori, Mom said during one of our phone calls. You could do anything. Why choose something so limiting? Limiting. That's what they called 4 years of college, officer candidate school, and a career that would take me places they'd never imagined. But I was used to their perspective by then. In their minds, my choices were always slightly wrong, my successes always incomplete. The first few years of service proved them wrong in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I was good at the work, really good. My commanding officers recognized my attention to detail and ability to synthesize complex information. My peers respected my judgment. My subordinates trusted my decisions. For the first time in my life, I existed in a system where competence was not just noticed, but celebrated. I sent photos home from training exercises and overseas assignments. I shared news about commendations and promotions. I even sent money when Nathaniel lost his job or when Riley needed help with car repairs. The response was always the same, polite interest followed by subtle redirection to more pressing family concerns. That's nice, honey, Mom would say about a distinguished service award. Did you know Riley got promoted to assistant manager at the restaurant? The comparison never stopped. My achievements were always measured against their expectations rather than celebrated for their own merit. A promotion to lieutenant was nice, but when would I think about settling down? A deployment to Germany was interesting, but didn't I miss being close to family? An assignment to intelligence analysis was impressive, but wasn't I tired of all that traveling? Their questions carried an assumption that stung more than outright criticism, that my life was somehow temporary, a phase I'd outgrow when I came to my senses and chose something more conventional. They never said it directly, but I heard the message. Your real life is waiting for you here, where we can understand it and approve of it properly. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was building something they couldn't diminish with their casual dismissal or faint praise. Every successful mission, every positive evaluation, every moment of trust from people who understood the stakes of our work, these things belonged to me in ways that family approval never had. The distance between us grew not because I loved them less, but because I finally loved myself enough to stop apologizing for who I'd become. They called it selfishness. I called it survival. By my 5th year of service, the pattern was set. I would always be the family member who'd chosen something they couldn't quite approve of, something that took me away from their version of what mattered. And they would always be the family that loved me conditionally, as long as I was willing to be smaller than my potential. I stopped being willing. The signs started small, the way family slights always do. A Christmas card addressed to the Reynolds family and Lori. An invitation to Nathaniel's birthday party that arrived 2 days before the event, clearly an afterthought. A family photo session scheduled during my leave without anyone checking if I was available. We didn't know you'd be home, Mom explained when I mentioned it. Your schedule is so unpredictable. I had given them my leave dates 3 months in advance. The pattern accelerated as my career progressed. Captain's bars meant nothing when Riley's engagement ring prompted weeks of phone calls and planning sessions. A prestigious assignment to the Pentagon was overshadowed by Nathaniel finally getting a job at a local insurance agency, following in Dad's footsteps at last. We're so proud of Nathaniel for finding his direction, Dad said during one of our Sunday calls. It's never too late to settle into something stable. The implication hung between us like smoke. When would I find my direction? When would I settle into something they considered stable? Their version of my military service existed in a parallel universe, where I spent my days filing paperwork and my nights lonely in temporary housing. They knew I traveled, but they pictured airport hotels and conference rooms, not command centers and briefing rooms where decisions got made that affected thousands of people. They knew I had been promoted, but they imagined bureaucratic advancement rather than earned recognition for expertise and judgment. The disconnect became more obvious during family gatherings. Cousins would ask about my work with genuine curiosity, and I would start to explain a project or assignment, only to watch my parents' eyes glaze over or see them redirect conversation to safer topics. Lori's work is all classified, Mom would say with a little laugh. We never know what she's really up to. It was easier for them to treat my career as mysterious rather than significant. Mystery allowed them to maintain their narrative that I was somehow still the family member who hadn't quite figured things out yet. The rewriting of history was more subtle but more damaging. Stories about my childhood began to shift in their telling. The responsible older sister became the demanding perfectionist. The helpful daughter became the one who was never satisfied with family life. The reliable one became the one who always had to prove she was better than everyone else. Lori was always so driven, they would say to relatives, and it never sounded like a compliment. She could never just be happy with where she was. They weren't wrong about the driving part, but they had the cause and effect backwards. I wasn't driven because I was naturally dissatisfied. I was driven because satisfaction in our family required accepting a smaller version of myself than I was capable of being. Nathaniel had found his place by meeting their low expectations. He worked his insurance job, lived in an apartment 15 minutes from the family home, and showed up for Sunday dinners with reliable regularity. He was safe, predictable, and geographically convenient. Riley had found her place by needing just enough help to feel rescued, but not so much as to be burdensome. Her engagement to a local electrician promised grandchildren and holiday traditions that would center around the family home. I had found my place by leaving, and that felt like rejection to people who measured love by proximity and conformity. The criticism became more pointed as I approached my 10th year of service. Casual comments about my commitment issues when I mentioned ending a relationship with a fellow officer. Questions about my priorities when I took an assignment that required extended travel. Jokes about my independence that carried an edge of disapproval. Don't you want to settle down somewhere? Aunt Linda asked during Riley's engagement party. All this moving around must get exhausting. I was 32 years old, financially stable, professionally successful, and personally content. But in their eyes, I was an exhausted nomad who hadn't figured out how to build a real life yet. The breaking point was building, and I could feel it coming like pressure before a storm. Every conversation required more energy to navigate. Every visit required more effort to deflect their subtle disapproval. Every achievement felt hollow when the people who were supposed to celebrate it couldn't see past their own limitations to recognize what I had accomplished. I loved them, but I was tired of being their disappointment. And I was tired of pretending that their disappointment was reasonable. Something had to give, and I was no longer willing to let it be me. The invitation arrived on official letterhead, cream-colored paper with Riley's name embossed in gold script. Her wedding would be held at the Riverside Country Club, the most prestigious venue in town. The ceremony would begin at 4 o'clock on a Saturday in June. Reception to follow, with dinner and dancing until midnight. I had known about the wedding for 8 months. We had discussed dates, venues, and guest lists during multiple phone calls. Riley had even asked me to be her maid of honor, though she rescinded the offer when I explained that my deployment schedule might interfere with pre-wedding events. It's just that I need someone who can really be there, she said. You understand. I understood. I also understood that Nathaniel was still the best man despite having missed the engagement party and 2 wedding planning sessions because of his weekend poker tournaments. But the invitation itself was a revelation. Thick cardstock announced the marriage of Riley Michelle Reynolds to James Robert Patterson. The bride's parents, Robert and Susan Reynolds, requested the honor of my presence. Military personnel were specifically asked to wear dress uniform. That last line hit me like recognition. They wanted me in uniform because it looked good, because a military officer in dress blues would add prestige to their photographs and conversations. They wanted the appearance of my service without having to acknowledge what it actually meant. I called to confirm my attendance and to clarify the dress code. Are you sure you want military personnel in uniform? I asked Mom. It might draw attention away from Riley. Oh no, we want you to wear it, she said quickly. We're so proud to have an officer in the family. Everyone will be impressed. Everyone would be impressed. Not proud of my service or grateful for my sacrifice, but impressed by the costume I could wear to their event. The wedding was 3 weeks away when the second shoe dropped. I received a call from my cousin Janet, who was helping coordinate the reception seating. I'm having trouble with the family table, she said. Your mom wants to put you with the young professionals instead of with the immediate family. She says you'll have more in common with them. The young professionals table. where they seated guests who didn't quite fit the family narrative but were too important to ignore entirely. Lawyers and doctors and business owners who were successful enough to deserve good seats, but not intimate enough to sit with parents and siblings. Did she say why? I asked. Janet's pause told me everything. She just thinks you might be more comfortable there. You know, with people who understand your lifestyle. My lifestyle. As if being a military officer was a bohemian choice rather than a professional commitment. I could have pushed back, could have insisted on my place at the family table. But something in me was tired of insisting on recognition that should have been offered freely. Instead, I accepted the assignment and began to understand what I was really dealing with. They wanted me present but not prominent. Impressive but not influential. Decorative but not decisive. 2 weeks before the wedding, the final insult arrived in a phone call from Dad. "We need to talk about your speech," he said. "I'm not giving a speech." "Well, that's what we need to talk about. Your mother thinks it would be better if you didn't. You know how you can get when you're talking about work, and this is Riley's day. We don't want anything to overshadow her moment." How I can get? As if my passion for work I believed in was a personality flaw rather than evidence of commitment and expertise. "I wasn't planning to talk about work," I said. "It's just that military stuff can make people uncomfortable. It's so serious, and we want this to be a celebration." Military stuff. Like my career was a hobby that had gotten out of hand. The conversation ended with an agreement that I would attend the wedding as a supportive sister who looked impressive in uniform, but didn't actually say anything that might remind people what the uniform represented. I would be seen and not heard, present and not participatory. I hung up the phone and realized that somewhere in the last decade, I had become a stranger in my own family. Not because I had changed too much, but because I had refused to change little enough. They had been willing to love me as long as I remained manageable. The moment I became fully myself, competent, confident, and committed to something they couldn't control, I became a problem to be managed rather than a person to be celebrated. The wedding was still 2 weeks away, but I was already planning my exit strategy. Not from the event, but from the pattern that had brought me to this point. I was done being their decorated disappointment. I was done accepting invitations that came with conditions and expectations that diminished who I had worked to become. Riley deserved a sister who showed up with genuine joy rather than defensive exhaustion. My parents deserved honesty rather than the careful performance I had been delivering for years. And I deserved to stop pretending that their limitations were my responsibility to accommodate. The uniform they wanted me to wear represented something they couldn't understand, but also couldn't ignore. It was time to let it speak for itself. The morning of Riley's wedding arrived with the kind of crisp June weather that makes photographers smile and brides weep with relief. I had driven down from my base assignment the night before, staying at a hotel rather than at the family home to avoid the pre-wedding chaos and the subtle tensions that seemed to follow me there. My dress uniform hung perfectly pressed in the hotel closet. Navy blue with gold trim, ribbons arranged in precise rows, captain's bars gleaming on my shoulders. I had worn this uniform to ceremonies and official functions dozens of times, but today it felt different. Today it felt like armor. I arrived at the country club an hour before the ceremony, early enough to help with last-minute details, but not so early as to get pulled into family drama. The venue was everything Riley had dreamed of: white columns, manicured gardens, a view of the river that would make for perfect photographs. Mom intercepted me in the lobby, looking elegant in her mother-of-the-bride dress, but carrying the tight expression that meant she was managing a dozen small crises. "Lori, thank goodness you're here," she said, then paused as she took in my uniform. "You look very official." Official. Not proud, not impressive, not beautiful. Official, like I was there in a professional capacity rather than as family. "Is there something I can help with?" I asked. "Actually, yes. We're having a small issue with the seating arrangement. Some of Riley's friends brought dates we weren't expecting, and we need to make room at your table." My table. The young professional's table where I had been assigned to avoid disrupting the family dynamic. "That's fine," I said. "Whatever you need." But as I walked toward the reception hall to survey the situation, I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. Uncle Bill was talking to a colleague near the bar, gesturing toward the wedding party photos being taken in the garden. "That's our military daughter," he was saying. "Lori. She's career Army, very dedicated. Of course, it's been hard on the family, having her gone so much. We hardly see her anymore." Career Army. I was Navy, and he knew it. "We hardly see her anymore," as if my absence was selfish rather than service-related. But it was the next comment that really landed. "Between you and me, we're all hoping this military phase runs its course soon. She's getting to that age where she needs to think about settling down for real, maybe finding something closer to home." Military phase. As if 10 years of service, 3 deployments, and a rank that had taken years to earn were equivalent to Riley's brief stint as a yoga instructor. I stood there in my dress uniform, surrounded by flowers and celebration, and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't love complicated by misunderstanding. This was fundamental disrespect disguised as concern. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Riley looked radiant, James looked nervous in the way grooms should, and the pastor spoke about commitment and partnership with genuine warmth. I sat in my assigned seat, 3 rows back from the family section, and watched my sister promise to love and honor someone who would never have to choose between her career and his approval. During the reception cocktail hour, the pattern continued. Relatives approached me with curiosity about my uniform and polite questions about my work, but the conversations were consistently redirected by family members who seemed determined to keep military topics safely contained. "Lori's job is so technical," Mom would say when someone asked about my deployment experiences. "She's much more fun when she's talking about other things." Technical. As if intelligence analysis was equivalent to computer repair rather than the kind of strategic thinking that kept people safe. When dinner was announced, I found my way to the young professionals' table as directed. My table mates were pleasant enough: a lawyer, 2 doctors, an engineer, and a marketing executive. They treated me with the respect that my rank and experience deserved, asking informed questions about military life and sharing stories about their own career challenges. "It must be incredible to know that your work has real impact," said the engineer. "I mean, we're all just trying to make money or build things people want. You're actually serving something bigger." I felt more understood in 10 minutes of conversation with these strangers than I had in years of family gatherings. But even as I enjoyed their company, I was aware of the family table 20 feet away. Nathaniel was regaling everyone with stories about his insurance work, describing client interactions with exaggerated humor. Riley and James were glowing with newlywed happiness, accepting congratulations and advice from relatives who clearly adored them. And my parents were holding court, playing their roles as proud family matriarch and patriarch, accepting compliments on the wedding and their children with gracious smiles. Their children. Plural. But when people asked about all their kids, the focus always shifted to Nathaniel's steady job and Riley's new marriage. I was mentioned in passing, if at all. During the toasts, Nathaniel delivered a heartfelt speech about Riley's determination and kindness. Dad spoke about watching his children grow into adults he was proud to know. Several cousins shared funny stories about Riley's childhood and predictions about her future happiness. I was not invited to speak. I was not mentioned in anyone's speech except in passing references to all of us who loved Riley. After dinner, during the dancing portion of the reception, I found myself standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching couples spin and laugh under the soft lighting. The lawyer from my table approached and asked if I wanted to dance, and we spent a pleasant few minutes talking about travel and career ambitions. When the song ended, I noticed a small commotion near the entrance to the reception hall. A man in military dress uniform was speaking with the venue coordinator, showing identification and asking questions. Even from a distance, I could see the stars on his shoulders. General Morrison. My commanding officer's commanding officer, a man I had briefed twice, but never interacted with socially. What was he doing at Riley's wedding? The answer came quickly as the venue coordinator led him toward the family table. I watched Mom's face transform from confusion to delight as the general introduced himself and explained his connection. I was in the area for another event and wanted to stop by to congratulate one of our finest officers on her sister's wedding, he said in the clear, carrying voice that military leaders develop. Captain Reynolds has been an exceptional addition to our intelligence team. You must be very proud. The conversation was loud enough to carry across the reception hall, and I watched heads turn as people processed what they were hearing. A general had come to Riley's wedding specifically to honor me. Mom's response was everything I had learned to expect. "Oh, how thoughtful of you to stop by," she said. "Lori will be so pleased. She's sitting right over there with some friends." Friends. Not family. Friends. But General Morrison wasn't finished. "Actually, I was hoping to have a word with Captain Reynolds, if that's possible. I have some news about a commendation that might interest your family." A commendation. I had no idea what he was referring to, but suddenly I was walking toward the family table with every eye in the room following me. "Captain Reynolds," the general said as I approached. "Congratulations on your sister's wedding, and congratulations on the Distinguished Intelligence Cross. The official ceremony is next month, but I wanted to personally inform you that the award has been approved. The Distinguished Intelligence Cross, the second highest decoration available to intelligence personnel, awarded for exceptional service that contributes significantly to national security." I had submitted paperwork months ago for a joint task force operation that had been successful beyond our initial projections, but awards at that level took time to process and were never guaranteed. "Thank you, sir," I managed. "I'm honored." "The honor is ours, Captain. Your analysis and recommendations during Operation Sterling Shield prevented what could have been a significant intelligence failure. The Joint Chiefs specifically requested that you be recognized." The Joint Chiefs. The highest-ranking officers in the military, people who made decisions that affected global strategy. They had specifically requested my recognition. I could feel the entire room listening now. Riley's wedding reception had become an impromptu military ceremony, and my family was experiencing the disconnect between their perception of my career and its actual significance. General Morrison continued, "I know your family must be very proud of your service. It's rare to see such dedication and expertise in someone so young in their career." He turned to address the family table directly. "Captain Reynolds' work has been instrumental in several key operations. You've raised a remarkable officer." The silence that followed was dense with realization. Mom's smile was frozen in place. Dad looked like he was calculating something. Nathaniel and Riley exchanged glances that contained years of assumption being suddenly revised. "We are proud," Mom said finally. "So proud." But her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had just learned that the thing she had been minimizing was actually significant beyond her comprehension. General Morrison stayed for 10 more minutes, long enough to make clear that this wasn't a perfunctory visit, but a genuine recognition of merit. When he left, he shook my hand with the kind of respect that can't be performed or faked. "Congratulations again, Captain. The ceremony is June 15th at the Pentagon. I hope your family can attend." The Pentagon, where generals and cabinet officials gathered to recognize service that mattered at the highest levels of government. As he walked away, I became aware that the entire reception was looking at me with new eyes. The impressive uniform was no longer just costume for family photos. The sister they had relegated to the professionals' table was apparently the kind of person that generals sought out to honor. But the moment that mattered most was watching my family's faces as they processed what had just happened. Years of casual dismissal had collided with undeniable external validation, and the cognitive dissonance was visible in their expressions. They were proud, they claimed. But pride built on ignorance feels different than pride built on understanding. And I was finally old enough to know the difference. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of congratulations from relatives and strangers who had witnessed the exchange. People who had politely ignored my career for years suddenly had detailed questions about military life and service opportunities. But the family table remained oddly quiet, as if they were unsure how to integrate this new information into their existing narrative about who I was and what I had chosen. Riley approached me as the evening was winding down. "Lori, that was incredible. I had no idea your work was so important." "It's what I've been trying to tell you for years," I said gently. "I know. I'm sorry. I think we all just didn't understand. Didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. The distinction mattered, but this wasn't the time or place to explore it. Thank you for including me today, I said instead. Your wedding was beautiful. And it had been beautiful, even with all the complications. But for the first time in years, I had been seen at a family event for who I actually was rather than who they wanted me to be. It was a beginning. The weeks following Riley's wedding brought a shift I hadn't expected. Phone calls from relatives who had been politely distant for years. Invitations to family events that arrived with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligatory inclusion. Questions about military life that sounded curious rather than skeptical. But the most significant change was in my immediate family's communication. Mom started asking specific questions about my work, using terminology she had clearly researched. Dad mentioned my upcoming commendation to neighbors and colleagues with obvious pride. Nathaniel called to ask if I could help his friend's son understand military career options. The transformation felt surreal after years of subtle dismissal. We've been thinking, Mom said during one of our Sunday calls. We'd like to come to Washington for your ceremony. If that's something you'd want. Something I'd want. For 10 years, I had wanted them to show interest in my career. Now that the interest had arrived, I wasn't sure how to respond. I would like that, I said carefully. But I want you to come because you're genuinely proud, not because a general told you that you should be. The silence on the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if we had been disconnected. Lori, she said finally, I think we owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. The apology, when it came, was more thorough than I had expected. Mom acknowledged the ways they had minimized my achievements and excluded me from family celebrations. She admitted that they hadn't understood the significance of my career and had been uncomfortable with their own ignorance. It was easier to act like your work wasn't important than to admit we didn't understand it, she said. But that wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to us either. We missed so much. Dad's apology came separately, delivered with the careful precision of someone who is used to examining details professionally. I keep thinking about all the times I suggested you find something more stable, he said. I was measuring your career against standards that didn't apply. That was my limitation, not your problem. Nathaniel and Riley both called to offer their own versions of acknowledgement and regret. The conversations were awkward but genuine, filled with the kind of honesty that families usually avoid. But apologies, however sincere, couldn't erase years of accumulated hurt. Trust, once damaged, requires time and consistent action to repair. I appreciated their recognition of the problem, but I wasn't ready to pretend that recognition alone fixed everything. The Distinguished Intelligence Cross ceremony took place at the Pentagon on a Thursday morning in June. My family arrived the day before, staying at a hotel in Arlington and taking tours of monuments and museums like tourists visiting a foreign country. When they saw me in my dress uniform at the ceremony, standing among other recipients while senior officials read citations for classified operations that couldn't be fully described, I watched understanding finally dawn in their faces. This wasn't a participation trophy or bureaucratic recognition. This was acknowledgement of work that had required years of preparation, months of analysis, and decisions that affected people they would never meet in ways they might never understand. After the ceremony, as we stood in the Pentagon parking lot, Dad looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. I don't think I really understood what you do until today, he said. Not the specifics, obviously, but the level of responsibility. The trust they place in you. It's what I've been trying to show you, I said. I know. I'm sorry it took a general telling us for us to really see it. The relationship rebuilding that followed was gradual and sometimes frustrating. Years of ingrained patterns don't disappear overnight, and there were moments when the old assumptions surfaced in conversation. But there were also new patterns emerging. Mom started sending articles about military affairs with notes asking for my perspective. Dad began describing my career accurately when talking to friends, using details he had researched to understand what I actually did. Nathaniel and Riley made efforts to include me in family decisions and celebrations with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligatory politeness. The change wasn't perfect, but it was real. And more importantly, it was based on accepting who I actually was rather than trying to reshape me into someone more convenient for them to understand. 6 months later, I received orders for a new assignment that would station me closer to home. Not because I had requested proximity to family, but because the position matched my expertise and career progression goals. When I told them about the assignment during our Sunday call, the response was different than it would have been a year earlier. "That's wonderful news," Mom said. "Not just that you'll be closer, but that you're being given opportunities that match your abilities." The distinction mattered. They were happy I would be nearby, but they understood that geography was secondary to professional development. They had learned to celebrate my career advancement on its own terms rather than only valuing the aspects that benefited them. The new assignment came with increased responsibility and a promotion to major. The promotion ceremony took place on a Friday afternoon, and my entire immediate family attended without being asked. As they watched me take the oath and receive the new rank insignia, I realized that this was what I had been wanting all along. Not their approval of my choices, but their understanding of who I had chosen to become. The ceremony was small and professional, nothing like the dramatic confrontation at Riley's wedding. But it represented something more significant, a family that had learned to see me clearly and choose to be proud of what they saw. After the ceremony, we went to dinner at a restaurant near the base. The conversation was easy in ways it hadn't been for years, filled with questions about my new responsibilities and stories about their own work and lives. "I have something to tell you," Riley said as we were finishing dessert. "James and I have been talking about starting a family, and we want to ask if you'd be the godmother." Godmother. Not honorary aunt or occasional visitor, but godmother. Someone trusted with responsibility for a child's moral and spiritual development, someone expected to be present and influential throughout their life. "I would be honored," I said. "We want our kids to know they have an aunt who serves her country and makes a difference in the world," James added. "That's the kind of example we want to set. The kind of example we want to set." My career, which had been seen as selfishly ambitious, was now viewed as a positive influence for the next generation. 6 months into my new assignment, the family dynamics had settled into patterns that felt sustainable. I attended family gatherings as myself rather than as a performance of who they wanted me to be. They asked about my work with genuine interest rather than polite deflection. Nathaniel had started researching military history, and Dad had begun reading books about intelligence operations. The relationships weren't perfect, but they were honest. And honesty, I had learned, was more valuable than harmony built on mutual misunderstanding. The biggest test came when I received orders for another overseas deployment. The old family would have seen this as evidence that I was choosing career over commitment to them. The new family saw it as recognition of my expertise and importance. "How long will you be gone?" Mom asked when I told them about the assignment. "Probably 18 months, but it could be extended depending on operational requirements." "Well, we'll miss you, but we're proud that you're trusted with important work," she said. "Just promise you'll stay safe and keep in touch." Stay safe and keep in touch. Not, "Maybe it's time to consider something less demanding," or "Don't you think you've done enough?" Just maternal concern combined with respect for my professional judgment. The deployment went well, contributing to successes that I couldn't discuss in detail, but that earned recognition from people whose opinions mattered in my field. When I returned, I found a family that had continued to grow in understanding during my absence. They had followed military news more closely, trying to understand the contexts in which I worked. They had visited military museums and attended local veterans events. They had, in small but meaningful ways, educated themselves about the world I had chosen. The effort they put into understanding meant more than any apology could have. It demonstrated that their change in perspective was genuine rather than performative, based on respect rather than just recognition. During my first family dinner after returning from deployment, Dad raised his glass in a toast. "To Lori, who has served with distinction and honor, and who has taught us that love means accepting people for who they are rather than who we think they should be." The toast was simple, but it contained years of learning compressed into a single acknowledgement. They had figured out how to be proud of me without needing to change me, and I had figured out how to love them without needing to diminish myself. 2 years later, at Nathaniel's wedding, I sat at the family table wearing my dress uniform by specific request. When the best man asked during his speech for family members to stand and be recognized, I rose with genuine pride rather than defensive anticipation. The applause that followed felt different than the polite recognition I had received for years. It sounded like appreciation rather than obligation, understanding rather than ignorance. After the reception, as I was preparing to leave, Mom pulled me aside. "I keep thinking about Riley's wedding," she said. "About how we treated you that day, and about everything that came after." "That was a long time ago," I said. "I know, but I want you to understand something. When that general walked into Riley's reception and said those things about your work, it wasn't just embarrassing because we had been wrong about your career. It was embarrassing because we realized we had been wrong about you as a person." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We raised you to be responsible and capable, and then we spent years being uncomfortable with how responsible and capable you became. That says something about us that I'm still learning to understand." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering territory we had avoided for years. She talked about her own fears and limitations, about how my success had challenged assumptions she hadn't realized she was making. I talked about the loneliness of achieving things that felt invisible to the people whose approval had once mattered most. By the end of the conversation, we had reached something that felt like resolution. Not because all the hurt had disappeared, but because we had both acknowledged our parts in creating and perpetuating it. The drive home from Nathaniel's wedding took me past the country club where Riley's reception had been held 3 years earlier. The building looked the same, but my relationship to that memory had fundamentally changed. The humiliation I had felt that night had been real, but it had also been the catalyst for everything that came after. The moment when General Morrison escorted me from the edges of my family's approval to its center hadn't just been about military recognition. It had been about forcing a reckoning with assumptions that had limited all of us. They had learned to see me clearly. I had learned to demand that clarity. And we had all learned that love without respect is just another form of control. 3 months later, I received a call that would test these new dynamics one final time. I had been selected for promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment to a position that would require relocation to another continent for at least 3 years. The old me would have agonized over how to tell them, would have prepared for disappointment and subtle pressure to refuse the assignment. The new me simply called during our regular Sunday conversation and shared the news straightforwardly. "That's incredible, Lori," Dad said immediately. "What an honor. When do you leave?" "Probably 6 months from now, once all the clearances and logistics are handled. We'll plan a family celebration before you go," Mom added. "This deserves recognition." A family celebration. For my achievement, on my terms, because they genuinely understood what it meant. The celebration they planned exceeded my expectations. They rented a private room at a nice restaurant and invited extended family and family friends. Dad prepared remarks that demonstrated real understanding of my career progression and the significance of the new assignment. Nathaniel and Riley both spoke about lessons they had learned from watching me pursue my goals despite obstacles. But the moment that meant the most came at the end of the evening, when my nephew Riley's son, born the previous year, fell asleep in my arms while I was still wearing my dress uniform. "He should get used to that uniform," Riley said quietly. "He's going to be seeing a lot of it over the years." Seeing a lot of it, not because I would be visiting occasionally when convenient, but because I would be a constant presence in his life, even when geography separated us. They had learned to think of distance as logistical rather than emotional, temporary rather than permanent. The overseas assignment proved to be the most rewarding of my career. The work was complex and significant, contributing to international cooperation efforts that made news headlines without anyone knowing about the intelligence analysis that made them possible. My family followed my career from afar with engagement that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. They sent care packages that showed understanding of where I was and what I might need. They arranged video calls that worked with my schedule rather than expecting me to accommodate theirs. They shared news about my work with their friends and colleagues with obvious pride. When I returned from that assignment, I found a family that had continued to evolve in my absence. They had learned to be proud of me in ways that didn't require my presence to validate. My success belonged to me, but their pride in it belonged to them, and the distinction had made both things more genuine. The house where I had grown up felt different when I visited after my return. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the emotional geography had been redrawn. I was no longer the family member who needed to prove herself worthy of inclusion. I was the family member whose inclusion was assumed and valued. During that visit, I found myself in the garage with Dad, helping him organize tools that had accumulated over decades of home maintenance projects. "I've been thinking about something," he said as we sorted through boxes of screws and bolts. "About the way we used to talk about your career choices." "What about it?" "I think I was afraid that if we were too supportive, too proud, you'd think we were trying to take credit for your achievements. So I went the other direction and acted like they weren't that significant." The observation surprised me with its insight. "But that backfired," he continued, "because it made you feel like we didn't see what you were accomplishing. And it made us miss out on celebrating things we should have been celebrating all along." "Why are you thinking about this now?" "Because I want to make sure we don't make the same mistake with your nephew. I want him to grow up knowing that the adults in his life can be proud of his achievements without needing to control them or take credit for them." The conversation represented something I had been hoping for without realizing it, evidence that the lessons learned from our relationship difficulties would benefit the next generation. My struggles with family acceptance hadn't been wasted if they prevented similar struggles for my nephew. 6 months later, I received news that my next assignment would bring me back to a base less than 2 hours from my hometown. The proximity wasn't coincidental. I had specifically requested positions that would allow me to be more present for my nephew's childhood, but it also wasn't a sacrifice. The assignment matched my career goals and offered opportunities for advancement that excited me professionally. When I told my family about the assignment, their response reflected all the growth of the past few years. "We're thrilled you'll be closer," Mom said, "but more importantly, we're thrilled that you're getting opportunities that match your talents." They were thrilled I would be closer, but they understood that career considerations had driven the decision. They had learned to trust that I would balance professional and personal priorities without needing their guidance or approval. The new assignment began on a Monday in September. That weekend, my family threw a welcome home party that felt genuinely celebratory rather than obligatory. Relatives who had been politely distant during my early career years now asked detailed questions about my work and shared my answers with obvious pride. But the moment that crystallized how much had changed came during a conversation with my teenage cousin, who was considering her own career options. "Aunt Lori," she said, "my parents think I should choose something stable and practical. But I want to do something that matters, even if it's harder or takes me away sometimes. How did you know you were making the right choice?" The question contained assumptions that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. She saw my career as something that mattered, something worth aspiring to, something that required courage rather than something that demonstrated inability to settle down properly. "I knew because I could imagine being proud of myself in 20 years if I succeeded," I told her. "And I couldn't imagine being proud of myself in 20 years if I played it safe instead. Do you think my parents will understand if I choose something challenging?" I looked across the room at her parents, who were listening to Dad explain some aspect of military logistics with genuine interest, and then at Mom, who was showing photos from my promotion ceremony to relatives who asked detailed questions about military traditions. "They might not understand immediately," I said. "But if you're willing to help them learn, and if you're committed to your choice, they'll come around." Parents usually do, once they see that your happiness comes from being fully yourself rather than from being what they think you should be. The advice was based on experience that had cost me years of frustration and loneliness, but that had ultimately led to relationships built on truth rather than performance. The struggle had been worth it, not just for me, but for everyone in my family who had learned to love more authentically as a result. That night, as the party was winding down, I found myself standing in the backyard with Riley, watching our nephew play with toys while the adults cleaned up inside. "Do you remember what you said at my wedding?" she asked. "About how you'd been trying to tell us about your work for years?" "I remember. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About all the things you tried to share that we weren't ready to hear." She paused, watching her son stack blocks with the intense concentration that toddlers bring to important tasks. "I want him to grow up in a family where people listen the first time, where we don't need generals showing up to make us pay attention to each other." "He will," I said. "You've all learned how to do that now." And they had. The family I had grown up with had been replaced by a family that knew how to be proud of achievements they didn't fully understand, how to support choices that made them uncomfortable, and how to love people for who they were rather than who they might become with enough guidance. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. And standing in that backyard, watching my nephew play while surrounded by adults who had learned to see clearly and love without conditions, I understood that the real victory wasn't the moment when General Morrison had escorted me to recognition. The real victory was this: a family that had learned to celebrate each other's successes without needing external validation to recognize their significance. A family where belonging wasn't contingent on conformity, where love wasn't confused with control, and where achievements were valued for their own merit rather than for how well they fit predetermined expectations. It had taken years to build, but it was built to last. And it was worth every difficult conversation, every moment of loneliness, and every choice to demand respect rather than settle for tolerance. 5 years after Riley's wedding, I stood in the same country club, this time as the maid of honor at my cousin Janet's ceremony. I wore my dress uniform by request, not as decoration but as representation of who I was and what I had accomplished. During the reception, as I watched Janet and her new husband dance their first dance as a married couple, I reflected on how much had changed since that night when I had stood outside, listening to my family celebrate without me. The woman who had accepted exclusion rather than confrontation was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth and insisted that others recognize it too. The family that had demanded I shrink to fit their comfort zone had learned to expand their understanding to accommodate my reality. It hadn't been revenge, exactly. Revenge suggests a desire to cause pain in return for pain received. What had happened was more like justice, a correction of imbalances that had harmed all of us, a realignment of relationships based on truth rather than convenience. The general who had walked into Riley's wedding that night had done more than honor my service. He had forced a reckoning with assumptions that had been limiting everyone in my family. They had learned to be proud of things they didn't fully understand. I had learned to expect recognition rather than accept dismissal. And all of us had learned that love, when it's genuine, makes room for the full truth of who people are rather than insisting they become smaller versions of themselves for the sake of family harmony. The music changed to a song that encouraged everyone to join the dancing. As I walked toward the dance floor, I caught my reflection in one of the club's mirrors. The woman looking back at me wore her uniform with confidence, carried herself with the bearing that came from years of earned respect, and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had fought for her place and won it honestly. She looked like someone worth celebrating. And finally, beautifully, completely, her family agreed. 10 years later, I stood at the podium in the Pentagon briefing room, addressing a room full of senior officers and civilian officials about intelligence protocols that would shape policy for the next decade. The stars on my shoulders, I had been promoted to Brigadier General 18 months earlier, caught the light as I gestured toward the presentation screen. In the audience, sitting in the section reserved for family members, were Mom and Dad. They had flown in specifically for this briefing, not because I had asked them to, but because they had asked if they could attend. They wanted to see me in my element, doing the work that had taken me away from them for so many years, but had ultimately brought us closer together. After the briefing concluded and the attendees filed out, discussing implementation strategies and budget implications, my parents approached with expressions I had learned to recognize. Pride mixed with amazement that this was their daughter commanding rooms full of people who shaped national security policy. "That was remarkable," Dad said. "I understood maybe half of what you were discussing, but I could see that everyone in that room was listening to you like your opinion was the most important thing they'd hear all day." "Because it probably was," Mom added. "At least on those topics." The casual confidence in her statement reflected years of growth. She no longer needed to understand every detail of my work to recognize its importance. She had learned to trust the evidence, the rank I had earned, the respect I received from peers, the responsibilities I carried. We went to lunch at a restaurant near the Pentagon, where they peppered me with questions about the morning's presentation. Not polite questions designed to show interest, but genuine curiosity about subjects they found fascinating even when they couldn't fully grasp the implications. "The intelligence fusion process you described," Dad said over dessert, How long did it take you to develop that framework? About 3 years, with input from teams across multiple agencies. We had to coordinate with allies, integrate new technologies, and account for changing threat patterns. And now it's going to be used throughout the intelligence community? If it gets approved at the next level, yes. It could become standard operating procedure for similar analyses. He leaned back in his chair, processing the scope of what I had described. Do you realize that you just casually mentioned developing something that will be used by thousands of people for years to come? I did realize it, but his recognition of the significance meant something I couldn't have predicted when I was younger. Their ability to understand the scale of my responsibilities, even without grasping all the technical details, represented a sophistication in our relationship that had taken decades to develop. The conversation turned to family news. Riley's son, my nephew, was now in middle school and had started asking questions about military service. Nathaniel had been promoted to regional manager at his insurance company and was considering a move that would bring him closer to where I was stationed. Extended family members regularly asked about my career with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. But the most significant development was something Mom mentioned almost in passing. Your cousin Jennifer is considering the Air Force Academy, she said. She's been talking to the family about it, and everyone's been so supportive. It's interesting how different the conversations are now compared to when you were making your choices. Different how, I wondered, but I didn't need to ask. I could imagine the conversations: encouragement instead of skepticism, excitement about opportunities instead of worry about stability, pride in service instead of concern about unconventional choices. Jennifer was benefiting from ground that I had spent years clearing. The family had learned to celebrate military service as a valid career path, to understand deployment as professional responsibility rather than personal abandonment, to see uniforms as symbols of achievement rather than evidence of inability to settle down. She's been asking about you specifically, Dad added. Wants to know about your experiences at the academy, your early assignments, how you navigated career decisions. I'd be happy to talk with her. She was hoping you might say that. She's particularly interested in intelligence work. The idea that a family member was actively seeking my guidance on career choices would have seemed impossible during my own academy years. Then, my path had been viewed as risky and potentially isolating. Now, it was seen as a model worth emulating. 3 weeks later, Jennifer visited me for a long weekend at my current assignment. She was 18, confident in ways I remembered being, but also more supported than I had felt at her age. Her questions were specific and well-researched, indicating that the family had been helping her prepare for our conversations rather than discouraging her interest. Everyone keeps telling me how proud they are that I'm considering service, she said as I showed her around the base. But I want to make sure I'm doing this for the right reasons, not just because it's what the family celebrates now. The maturity of her question impressed me. She was thinking about motivation and authenticity in ways that demonstrated real self-awareness. What would be the right reasons? I asked. Because I want to serve something bigger than myself. Because I think I'd be good at the work. Because I can imagine being proud of myself in 20 years if I succeed. The last phrase echoed something I had told her younger cousin years earlier, but she had made it her own through genuine reflection. We spent the weekend discussing everything from academy life to career progression to work-life balance in military service. Her questions revealed someone who understood both the opportunities and the sacrifices involved, someone who was choosing with full knowledge rather than romantic idealization. On Sunday evening, as I drove her to the airport, she asked the question I had been expecting. Do you think the family would have been this supportive of my choice if you hadn't gone first? Honestly? No. I think you're benefiting from lessons they learned the hard way when I was starting out. Do you resent that? That it was harder for you? I considered the question as we sat in airport traffic. Did I resent the years of subtle discouragement, the dismissive comments, the feeling that I was constantly proving myself to people who should have been supporting me from the beginning? I used to, I said finally. But I don't anymore. The struggle made me stronger, and it made all of us more honest with each other. You get to start with a family that already knows how to be proud of military service, but you also get to start with a family that knows how to have difficult conversations and work through misunderstandings. That seems like a fair trade. I think so too. Jennifer was accepted to the Air Force Academy 6 months later. The family celebration was everything mine hadn't been: enthusiastic, knowledgeable, and focused on the honor of her selection rather than concerns about her choice. Watching their response, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude for the path that had led us all to this point. The night before Jennifer left for the academy, the entire extended family gathered for a send-off dinner. During the toasts, Uncle Bill, the same uncle who had referred to my service as a phase years earlier, stood to speak. "I want to say something about the example that's been set in this family," he said, looking directly at me. "Lori showed us what it means to serve with distinction, even when that service wasn't fully understood or appreciated by the people who should have known better." He paused, his voice carrying the weight of years of recognition and regret. "Jennifer is starting her journey with advantages that Lori didn't have: a family that knows how to support military service and people who understand what she's undertaking. But Lori started her journey with something Jennifer might not need: the determination to succeed even when support wasn't guaranteed." The toast that followed felt like a benediction on years of struggle that had ultimately benefited everyone in the room. The family member who had been misunderstood had become the family member whose example guided the next generation toward service and achievement. As the evening wound down, I found myself in the kitchen with Mom and Riley, cleaning dishes and talking about Jennifer's future. "I keep thinking about your academy graduation," Mom said as she dried wine glasses. "How we sat in those bleachers and watched you receive your commission, and I remember feeling proud but also confused about what came next." "Confused how?" "I didn't understand what your career would look like, what the day-to-day reality would be. I was proud that you had achieved something difficult, but I was also worried that you were choosing something that would take you away from everything familiar." She set down the glass she had been drying and looked at me directly. "Now, when I think about Jennifer's graduation in 4 years, I feel excited about what her career might look like. I understand the possibilities, the opportunities for growth and service and achievement. That's because you taught us to understand." The conversation continued as we finished cleaning up, touching on memories and possibilities in equal measure. By the time we said goodnight, I understood that the transformation in family relationships had been complete and permanent. They had learned to celebrate achievement they didn't fully comprehend, to support choices that challenged their expectations, and to love people for who they chose to become rather than who they had been expected to be. The following morning, as Jennifer prepared to leave for the academy, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that I understand what you did for all of us," she said. "Not just serving your country, but serving our family by refusing to accept being misunderstood." "I didn't set out to change anything for future generations," I said. "I just wanted to be seen clearly by the people I loved." "I know. But the result is that I get to start with a family that already knows how to see clearly. That's a gift that came from your determination to demand respect rather than accept dismissal." As I watched her walk toward the departure gate, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the bearing of someone ready to serve, I realized that the story that had begun with my exclusion from a family celebration had become a story about inclusion, understanding, and the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by other people's comfort zones. The general who had walked into Riley's wedding reception 15 years earlier had catalyzed a moment of recognition. But the lasting change had come from years of patient work, conversations that challenged assumptions, achievements that demanded acknowledgement, and love that insisted on truth rather than convenience. Jennifer would begin her academy experience with advantages I hadn't had: a family that understood military service, relatives who celebrated her choice without reservation, and the knowledge that her path was valued rather than tolerated. But she would also begin with something I had been forced to develop on my own: the understanding that respect must be earned through competence and character, not requested through pleading or performance. The transformation that had begun with rejection and grown through confrontation had become a legacy of support and understanding that would extend far beyond my own career. The family that had once asked me to sit outside had learned to make room for whoever its members chose to become. It was, I reflected as I drove home from the airport, the most complete victory I could have imagined. Thanks for listening. If this resonated, Like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder to set boundaries. Quick questions for you. Have you ever been sidelined by family at a big moment? What boundary changed the tone of your relationships, and did it stick? If someone publicly defended you, what would you want them to say? Would you choose reconciliation with conditions or distance with peace? Drop your answers in the comments. I read them all.